Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Captain Jess Wee here. So a bit about me. I'm a lawyer in the British Army, one of many, and part of my role is I'm also a legal advisor to the British Army's Cultural Property Protection Unit. So just to introduce myself and what I'm going to do, partly because I don't want to see my own face in the corner, is I'm going to turn my camera off now, but wanted to let you see that I'm a real person beforehand. So, okay. So the purpose of my 15 minutes is hopefully to talk to you about cultural property protection from a legal and a military perspective, and we'll hear from Commander Curtis shortly after, who'll go into a bit more detail on that. I do have to caveat this by saying that this brief is sort of my own personal views, and it doesn't represent the views of the MOD or the Army Legal Services. So that being said, Emma, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is broadly what I intend to talk to you about this afternoon. So why does protecting cultural property matter to UK defence? What is the legal basis for protection of cultural property? How do these obligations apply to the military? What has UK defence done to implement cultural property protection? And finally, the role of the military legal advisor in cultural property protection. Next slide, please. So first of all, why does protecting cultural property matter to UK defence? Well, first and foremost, right at the top there, because I'm a lawyer, and this is a very important part, and more important to me being a lawyer, but the legal requirements. So the UK government ratified the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict and its 2 additional protocols. And the ratification of that treaty places obligations on the armed forces and the UK in general towards cultural property protection, forming part of our obligations under the laws of armed conflict. So if we think about a scenario in which the military are operating overseas, damage and destruction, theft, pillage, misappropriation of cultural property is obviously illegal. And if it's done by UK forces, may attract criminal prosecution for individuals. And as part of that, it's going to damage the reputation of the unit who's operating in that area, the reputation of the military as a whole, and also falling back on the reputation of the UK. And it's also likely to damage the military's ability to influence the communities which they're operating in. Similarly, if you're going to be implicated in damage, destruction, theft of cultural property, that's likely to compromise force protection. So the safety of UK militaries operating in that environment. So by being aware and cognizant of a community's cultural property, that will assist in us keeping our people safe. The UK military is also going to have a much better understanding of the environments that they're operating in if they understand which cultural property is important to that particular community. Illicit cultural property trafficking can lead to threat finance, and that might support an adversary's operations against us. So obviously keen to avoid that, and as part of our obligations, we've undertaken to prohibit, prevent and stop theft, pillage or misappropriation of cultural property. And finally, a lot of studies show that protection of cultural property during an armed conflict or any other disaster will help those communities recover a lot quicker than if it was destroyed during them. Next slide, please. So where does cultural property protection come from, and sort of how has it evolved to the present day where we are at the moment? Well, first of all, it's got ancient origins in customary law. So generally, this is ancient rules protecting religious buildings, such as temples and places of worship. So to take an example, in medieval Europe, there were codes of chivalry, which protected churches and monasteries. The issue came where there were wars that involved people with different cultures, and then those rules protecting religious buildings were often ignored. So that was the situation for a while, and then there were attempts to draw up rules protecting cultural property in an international sense. So in the 19th century, onto the scene came general protection of civilian objects and the principle of immunity of cultural objects. So here we're really referring to, as an example, the Hague Conventions on respect to the laws and customs of war on land, 1899 and 1907. And that really advanced international law and established the principle of the immunity of cultural objects. Sadly, those provisions failed to prevent widespread damage to cultural objects during the First World War, and then even on a greater scale, the Second World War. So what the states decided to do to prevent recurrence is draft a convention specifically directed at cultural property protection. So this is where the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict and its first protocol came onto the scene. And this is now our primary source of law on cultural property protection. Other things that were done shortly after that, as not all states were bound by the Hague Convention, there was also insertion of articles protecting cultural property in the 2 protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions. So, for example, in additional protocol 1, it was prohibited to commit acts of hostility against historic monuments, works of art, places of worship, which constitute the cultural or spiritual heritage of peoples. So with all that in the background, the UK chose not to ratify the convention or accede to the first protocol in 1954, as it considered, and I think this was a held view among other countries, that it didn't provide an effective regime for the protection of cultural property. So the UK was then involved in negotiating the second protocol in 1999, and that was introduced a new system of heightened protection for cultural properties of very great importance, and requested that national legislation be put in place to punish serious violations of the convention. So this allayed a lot of the concerns of the UK and allowed it to announce its intention to ratify the convention. And finally, we've got the Cultural Property Armed Conflicts Act 2017. So this was enacted as existing legislation wasn't sufficient to enable the UK to comply fully with its obligations. And it introduced those legal provisions, and in particular, criminal offences for breaches of the Hague Convention international law. Next slide, please. So, as I've said, the ratification of the Hague Convention places international legal obligations relating to the protection of cultural property on the UK and its military forces. And that's principally during an armed conflict, although the convention does also impose some peacetime obligations. So this slide lists some of the UK military's obligations, both in a peacetime context and also in an armed conflict. And I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide about the steps the UK has taken in compliance with those. But broadly, on the left side, peacetime obligations can be summarised as education and training of the armed forces broadly, and also the establishment of specialist personnel to assist in securing respect for cultural property. And that's where the Army's Cultural Property Protection Unit comes into its own, and Commander Curtis will speak on that later. On the right-hand side, the basic protection afforded to cultural property in an armed conflict is that states must avoid using cultural property for military purposes, must not direct hostilities against it, and must protect it from theft, misappropriation, vandalism, and reprisals. And these obligations towards cultural property protection can only be waived if the property has become a military objective. Next slide, please. So the UK government has submitted its first periodic report to UNESCO in July of this year, and that sets out the steps it's taken to ensure that we're complying with our obligations under the convention and its protocols. And that's a document that anyone can read on the internet if you're interested. So some of the things that have been done, actually before the UK became a party to the 1954 convention, its armed forces already operated as though they were bound by the substantive provisions. And this was achieved through policy and direction in the Joint Service Manual on the Law of Armed Conflict, targeting policy and rules of engagement. Also, the dissemination of the knowledge of the Hague Convention and its protocols also, and are now still part of regular training in the law of armed conflict given to militaries, in particular for the army in the Law of Armed Conflict Manual, which is currently being updated to reflect our commitments, having ratified the Hague Convention. And also our training guidance mandates that all members of the UK Armed Forces should be trained in and maintain a baseline knowledge of the law of armed conflict. And prior to specific missions, we might provide additional training in cultural property to supplement this. So as I mentioned before, as part of the UK's ratification of the convention, the MOD requested the Army to establish a cultural property protection unit, which was done in 2018. And this is a unit of reservists with specialist expertise in cultural property. And their role is broadly to support exercises and training, targeting and operational planning, and provide advice to commanders and staff in relation to cultural property protection, and also to coordinate with civilian authorities responsible for safeguarding that cultural property. Finally, the Cultural Property Armed Conflicts Act also establishes a number of criminal offences and related penalties. There haven't been any criminal prosecutions under this legislation to date. But from a military perspective, the Service Prosecuting Authority is responsible for prosecution of members of the armed forces who contravene the law of England and Wales overseas. And they can be prosecuted at the courts martial. And a final point on this slide is that in terms of protection of cultural property, in an occupied territory, the UK also has a criminal offence of dealing in cultural property, which has been unlawfully exported from occupied territory. Next slide, please. And finally, just to finish off, what is the role of the military legal advisor in all of this? So in addition to the penalties and sanctions for breaches of the Hague Convention and compliant provisions to ensure compliance, UK service legal advisors, so that might be Air Force, Navy and Army, are always available to advise their commanders on the obligations under the Hague Convention and its II protocol, in addition to specialist cultural property advice from the Cultural Property Protection Unit for the Army. As a legal advisor to that unit, I provide training to the members of the unit themselves and on courses that they run internationally. I also provide legal assurance to any cultural property training we might be delivering overseas, and contribute to presentations to external organisations such as this. In terms of targeting, commanders have access to legal and policy advice when they're considering their targeting decisions. And this is to ensure that any action that they take is consistent with domestic and international law and UK policy. And finally, as I mentioned, the Cultural Property Armed Conflicts Act establishes a number of criminal offences. The Royal Military Police would have a hand in investigating possible commission of any offences under the Act, and the service prosecuting authority might be responsible for prosecuting those criminal offences through the service justice system. And military legal advisors could find themselves advising on evidential issues, for example, or indeed actually prosecuting those offences themselves in the courts martial. So that's the end of my presentation. I have no idea if I've gone over or under time, so apologies for that, but I hope you found it useful and happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
That was really fascinating, Jessica. Thank you so much. For those who haven't met me before, I'm Emma Cunliffe. I'm the Secretary for UK Blue Shield, and I'll be moderating the panel from here on. If anybody has any questions, please do put them in the chat. We'd really love that. We haven't had any come in to start with, but I think given how closely your presentation touches directly onto Commander Roger Curtis's presentation, what I'd like to do is pass the floor directly to Roger at this point. And we have his presentation, and then I can't help feeling like any questions you might have would apply equally for both speakers. So please do pop them in the chat and we'll ask them after Roger's presentation. Thank you very much. Roger, over to you.
Excellent, thank you. Can you just enable screen sharing, please, and I'll get my slides up.
Of course.
So by way of introduction then, my name is Roger Curtis. I'm a naval reservist and I've recently taken over as commander of the Cultural Property Protection Unit from, some of you will know, Colonel Tim Purbrick. And I'll give you a fairly quick run through on where the unit is just now and aspects related to its formation. Really picking up where Jess left off. So you've had the legal framework overall. Let's get into a little bit of detail. There is a lot of commonality between where we are now and the World War II Monuments Men. Some of you may have seen the movie. The reality of what we do in the present circumstances and environment is fairly different, but the idea is not a million miles off. So hold that thought, but actually we've got a slightly different set of operating principles. But I think it's worth remembering that a lot of the experience is now guided by the Hague Convention in its present form, was sort of evolved mainly by the UK British Army's experience in North Africa, in the Italian provinces, one of which was Sardinia. I've just put up an example here, where there was quite a lot of negative info ops from the Italians regarding how the monuments were being damaged either directly or indirectly by British activity. And that set in train some procedures which happened and evolved partly by circumstance and good fortune, but it really understood that you have to utilize local staff and populations, keeping people on in the posts to which they have often given much of their time and their existence, and also the security and control of sites, keeping the frameworks on which the archaeology or the antiquities or the heritage, whatever it is, operates in your in an occupied scenario. And this, of course, is very much within the conventional orbit of the Hague Convention, which critics would say was written for largely Cold War era, with perhaps fairly fixed boundaries between combatants, civilian populations, and the what might sometimes called the occupying power. A couple of notes on what you can do and not do. Caution with repair, really limited to emergency works only, and that was established very much in the Allied advance up through Italy. But the actual care and the looking after is done by those on the ground, by the host nation. And certainly reinstatement is a later task for the host nation, maybe as part of a subsequent reconstruction program. And all of this led to in the US, the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, which again featured in the film. So there's a lot of literature on what happened here and indeed for the whole Second World War. And it was quite well written up in the immediate years after the war. But this was really not taken forward until some much higher profile events, starting really with the Balkans conflict in the 90s, which got militaries thinking back into this space. And we're also very much aware of the situation in Iraq after the invasion there. But I think certainly in most militaries, awareness of cultural property, of where they're operating, is not new. And this example is from the northern part of Somaliland, taken by a British officer in the interwar period, catching perhaps a bit of looking for treasure in what was one of the abandoned towns, the Arabic towns in the north part of the country. But this information is all useful, and part of the roles of the unit is to start understanding where we may be, where the British Army may be, and how we can prepare to understand the cultural property that our colleagues on the ground will come into contact with. I won't dwell on this too much, but this is the slide that just reminds us of the context. And the unit exists because of the ratification of the Hague Convention that set up the unit. In terms of the detail, there is actually quite a lot of tactical and operational level detail within the Hague Convention once you dig down into the paragraphs. But in terms of a quick look for people to feel how the Army takes this, the Land Warfare Center Doctrine Note 1905 gives a very good summary of where they see cultural property protection operating in a land environment, including the benefits of getting this right that Jess alluded to. And then there's an overall publication, JSP 1325, which is under review right now under the heading Human Security. So CPP sits underneath the human security umbrella in defense, and that's perhaps worth bearing in mind how it shapes and guides our actions. But it's worth remembering it's not always what we think, what we think as CPP officers, it's what the host nation values. And a nuance now is that there may not necessarily be a host nation in some areas of conflict and tension. This is what the doctrine note looks like, and it's one, as I said, to get an overall view. You could say it has quite a few examples from the early 2000s in it. NATO doctrine is evolving, and in fact there's an event in November whereby this is going to be discussed in a bit more detail. At the moment, the unit does not have a full manual as such, because we're still learning very much how our world will operate, and some of the close procedures and details that units will follow. So at the moment, we're evolving the SOPs to use some Army acronyms, standard operating procedures, from which the manual will fall out in good time once we've got some experience to draw on and record. And just referring to what is cultural property, and actually it takes a very wide variety of objects, places, structures, buildings, monuments, records, archives, collections of things that sometimes may not be immediately obvious. This in the UK context, this is a Second World War element of coastal defence, which to many people is a concrete monstrosity and has no value. But actually, the host nation, in this case, the United Kingdom, has designated this, Historic Scotland has designated this a Category A listed structure, so it has full protection. And the site itself is also a scheduled site, so it has full protection. But many people, possibly some of my former colleagues in the Royal Navy, might look at that and just say, well, that's just a heap of concrete, why should I care about that? It's not their decision, it's how it is viewed by the host nation or the place where it sits. In terms of the unit, we've got a formal headcount of 15 reserve officers. We're born for 19 to account for a training pipeline. And also we have 4 positions for what are termed Group B reservists, which is those with very specific experiences and seniority in the sector. The background at the moment as it sits, a scattering of architects, archaeologists, building surveyors like myself, conservators, and those who've been involved with cultural policy. Although we sit within the British Army, we are a tri-service organisation, and the present allocation of posts is 1 R&R officer, myself, and 1 auxiliary RAF officer. And this balance of services may change depending on availability of staff and how we want to ensure that it has a tri-service capability, delivering CPP advice, guidance and support services across all areas of defence, not just on the green side. The unit formally stood up in 2018 with the first sort of collective training happening in October 2019, and some of the speakers were with me at Southwark Park for that exercise. And really since then, we've been doing recruiting and capability development since then, individual training, a lot of organisational stuff to sort out, and starting to extend our knowledge and understanding of the sector, because the Hague Convention requires preparation in this area, particularly in areas where the nation state, the UK in this instance, has interest, and understanding the laydown of the geography, the expertise you might need if you're going to operate there, the contacts and the networks, of which Blue Shield is very obviously a significant part, in advance of activity. So this is not about thinking about things once the troops land on the beach and all that sort of thing. The Hague Convention speaks explicitly about getting things organised in advance so that those networks and links are there to be utilised to share the knowledge needed when the balloon goes up. And by ways of current activity, I must emphasise that the CPPU is a tactical level formation. Essentially, at the moment, we're advising at more almost at company level. We don't do restitution, although we may get caught up in the interim custody of things. We don't do crime directly, but we know the people and we have good links with those who do. So this is about the military enabling and supporting and knowing the correct routes to the right civil authorities to address these under the host nation's rule of law and legal frameworks. At the moment, well, we are to support the field army deployments and other activity in support of HMG requirements, whatever they may be. At the moment, the focus is very much on land, but underwater cultural heritage is a significant area of new work and development. And we're working with colleagues in the Royal Canadian Navy and the United States Navy to progress some ideas and thinking on how CPP is considered, framed up and delivered in the maritime space. As I alluded to in the previous slide, we have a dialogue with the Blue Shield and developing our networks with the academic community in the areas and the disciplines that we're thinking about. And already we're getting a feel for specific areas of geography where we are paying attention. Obviously, as was alluded to in Jess's presentation, the Hague Convention obligation starts at home. This is understanding the need to educate one's own forces in the overall principles of respect and protect, but also now we're support to deployed UK forces in Kosovo and also in Mali, scoping out areas of interest, how we might approach such areas. And I've mentioned cultural heritage already, working with defence estates on our approach to training areas and how CP within those training areas is looked after on the principle that you've got to get it right on your own back door before you start taking it further. So an interesting dialogue on UK and foreign sovereign bases elsewhere. We work quite closely with the other armed forces on CPP development, and Captain Tim LeBert we've been working with on various things. And we also contribute to training run by various transnational organizations, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Austrian Army, for example, and the Irish Defence Force, to name but a couple. And obviously links and networks with Blue Shield and indeed others in the sector in this area. What does it look like at the moment? Here's an example from September 2020, where myself and one of the team were down at a training camp in the south of England, briefing D Squadron from the Royal Lancers prior to their deployment to Kosovo on a kind of recce mission and a support to the UN activity in that region. And one of the messages I think that we're shaping up to is getting an understanding to those there of the culture, the habits, and how the CP of that region might look. So for this example, some of you will clearly see that the mosque to the left-hand side of the image, and then in the near foreground is the baths. It's an associated structure that goes with that complex. But we're looking at educating our soldiers and officers and commanders in how the land looks and what's missing from something. So in this particular example, where might the library be? Is that still there? Where's the school? Is that still there? And if it's not there, why? What has happened to change that? Is that just pure modernization misery, or is that some act of deliberate damage or something? In the case of this establishment, is this still working? What does that say about the community who lives there and their social habits and practices? So a lot of this is about understanding the environment you're in, better knowing who you're working amongst and with, and understand their motivations in terms of culture and how they live and what's important to them, so that in the first instance, we ensure we don't damage it or break it, and also assure its security and safety during times when we may be in a position to be looking after it, either in some form of transition or maybe in various evolutions of how the tactical situation plays out in combat or tension. And then my final slide, just to stop, this is an emerging story from the earliest times, and I just put this up as a situation, an example from Scotland, when Edward I's invasion in 1296 consciously attacked cultural property, burning documents and records in Edinburgh, and then went on to a Roman site actually, and started to get that damaged. But interestingly, in my the last headed line there, the locals played a part in preventing its destruction. So utilizing and understanding the motivation of the locals. This is not a single CPPU coming to the rescue of everything at all. This is enabling cooperation and understanding between a wide range of contributors in the space to ensure the safety and protection of cultural property in all its various forms. And I think I'll stop there. Very happy to take questions. Happy with stunned silence.
Thank you so much, Roger. Sorry, it always takes me just, for all the speakers, give me a second with the Zoom panel control. It always takes me just a moment to sort that. So I've had one question come in, and if anybody else has any, do please type them into the chat. We would love that. The one that's come in that I'd like to ask, actually, which is a question for you both, for both yourself and Jess. Cultural property protection was originally badged to armed forces as a security issue, and that made a lot of sense. It has clear implications for security of mission, for risk assessment within that, and for mission success. But it was later then rebranded as a human security issue. And do you think that that dilutes it within armed forces and the mission and the way that that's understood? Or do you think that targets it and makes it easier for people to conceptualize and hones its reach? And I'll pass that first to Roger, and then also ask Captain if you've any comments as well, if that's okay.
Yes, no, thank you. That's a good one. My own feeling is if it was purely CPP on its own, it might find difficulty to find a bigger home within the defence arrangements on the ground at the time. And I think often issues affecting CPP go along with national instability, tension, failed states, and areas where things are not going quite as they should. So, for example, if you have a very poorly adhered to border, you have cross-border trafficking, maybe antiquities and CP, but also going with that is also elements of human trafficking and also narcotics and other things. So it is an indicator of trouble in a state, and it also has bad friends. So it makes sense in addressing that it's done in cohort with the other areas. So my feeling is it is better to be aligned with those other groupings, because it means you can better address that with other resources which can overlap in your efforts to address the shortcomings with the cultural property itself.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting perspective. And can I ask yourself, Jess, if you'd like to comment as well, because that question was to you both.
Thanks, Emma. Really good question. And I don't really think I've got anything much more insightful to add, to be honest. I mean, certainly from my experience, we're viewing human security as, you know, a broad range of different security issues. So I think from what Commander Curtis said is completely correct. We're able to give a coherent approach. I don't know if that's the right word, to all of these issues, rather than singling them out as individual problems. And I think as the military, that sometimes helps us focus on a whole package of you know, assistance that we can perhaps look at providing, rather than one individual thing. I hope that answers the question. As I said, I don't think I've had too much else to add. Thank you.
So, for example, in a border situation, let's say we have a military police deployed to assist with measures on that border, say supporting the host nation. There'd be dealing with narcotics at the border. There'd be dealing with human trafficking, and they would also be dealing with CP. And our task would be to fuse the CP element with those other disciplines that they're trying to address.
So if I could jump in then on the back of that, one of the ways cultural property is often sort of described is as a sort of, you know, a basic human need. It's a fundamental element of human culture, and it's about what matters to you. And the human security paradigm and protection of civilians often talks about facilitating access to basic needs. Do you think culture and cultural property protection comes in that as a basic need, or do you think that it sits as its own cross-cutting topic? I just really value any insights there. Thank you.
I think I would put it in the basic need for societal stability. So if you are looking at aiming towards what is sometimes called return to normality, there are many pillars by which you achieve that, and the priorities and order in which you achieve that is a matter for considerable discussion, no doubt, obviously starting with security. But thereafter, you have, I would say, many of these things work in parallel. And I'm fairly certain that it is written in more than one place that access to culture is a basic human need, and ultimately a right too. So I think culture and its protection is a legitimate part of addressing that necessary step towards normality.
Thank you very much. I think a couple of other people want to ask questions. If you do want to, please do type them into the chat so that we can direct them to the speakers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass the floor to Tim Lebert, our next speaker, but our first two panelists aren't going. So if you want to ask them questions, please do type them into the chat and we can always pass them over afterwards. Thank you. So I'm very pleased to introduce Captain Tim Lebert from the French Army, who's going to give us a different perspective from the UK perspective under cultural property protection. Thank you.
So thank you, Emma. I will share my screen to present you some French perspective on cultural property protection. So does it work well with the screen sharing?
It's within a window, but we can see it.
Yes, your screen is sharing, so.
Okay, thank you. So as I'm Captain Tim Lebert, Deputy Director of the French Army Heritage Office. This office takes place on the French Army General Staff in Paris, and we are actually in charge to protect, preserve the French Army heritage. That means it's more than 200,000 artifacts, 16 museums. We are in charge of the official army artists, painters, sculptors. And so we are specialists. We are, most of us are military curators, and therefore we are in charge to think and to develop specific expertise in cultural property protection. So I really agree with what the British Army explained us about the development of cultural property protection and why is it what this topic matters for the military. And it's really a military mission. When we look back in the history and we had some example of what the monuments men did, every time when war is coming, we are facing grave danger for the heritage and the preservation of collections. From a French perspective, we look back to World War I, when for the first time we had more than 150 soldiers. We were involved in a military cultural property protection missions. We had those soldiers were deployed in the north of France to evacuate a collection, to identify cultural property, and they were conducting with the specific units what we want to now really develop for the next years. So for us, it's really an example of a military involvement, of a military property protection. The French ratified the Hague Conventions in 1954, but we took really a long time to think this topic in the war of today. We are no more facing the same wars during World War I or World War II, and the world really changed since that time. Since the DELPAT was created in 1992, we first look on to develop this aspect, this specific expertise. The first question was, is cultural property a specific mission for the military. And this is something not really easy, because from a military side, we can say that it's not something for the military, it's something for heritage professionals. And since we develop military curators, there are full active duty officers. Actually, there is 22 of them working with us. We really understand that cultural property protection during our operations are really giving something as better, and because they understand the military development, military operations, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and they have the same background, military background as every officers in France, but even they have heritage and academic background, so they can really be effective when we are working with them on this topic. In 2000, for the first time, the DELPAT had some things to do with a blue shield and military protection of cultural property. So since 22 years past now, today, we are working to develop this topic in France. But we can say that since we took 15 years to develop effectively these things in the DELPAT, in 2015, for the first time, we adopt a specific doctrine, and since some months only, we are officially a military cultural property protection capacity in the French Army. So it's really interesting to look how this developed in UK, in France, but even in the US, to say that in the past 5 years, there was really a lot that have been done on this topic inside of the military. The question is really, how can we put some culture and some cultural heritage and inside of something which is really complex, the war and military operations. It's not something really easy, and we are facing this challenge. Where, when, how can we deal with cultural property protection in a war context? And we have to find the right solutions on the legal side, on the military side, to really be effective in that topic. Just one example. This is a picture of Timbuktu in 2013. The French ran a military operation there to liberate the city. From a military side, we can just think this operation as a generic military operations. But if we are putting some cultural property, this could be much more complex, and we have to deal with that. And at that point, our military commanders can understand that if we develop an expertise on cultural property protection on a military side, we can really help to avoid damage from our troops, and maybe to make cultural property and the military cultural property protection be effective in military operations. And maybe at some point we could use a military protection of cultural property to help us to gain influence, for example, or for cooperation, for military civilian cooperation. There is many things to do, but we need people who understand cultural heritage to speak effectively about that. So then with our military curator, we started some years ago to develop this topic. The French adopted in 2015 and then 2018 the first doctrinal document after the conventions to help us to understand this topic. We adopt a specific handbook on the protection of cultural property sorry. And this is the first time that the French army adopted a specific document to explain the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention is the starting point for us, where we had to specifically to implement this topic inside of our military procedures and inside of our military organization. And therefore now we need to develop, to implement during peacetime, but even during wartime, this topic. And this is really challenging, but we made the past years really a lot of progress. Until now, this topic is, I have to say, only an army topic in France, because cultural property are most of the time on land. There is some cultural property on sea and in underwater, but it's a topic for our Air Force, but first for the army on the ground. And therefore, the French army is leading this topic before the others army in France. So now, what can we do with our capacity, with our military curators and with our military organizations? We need to raise awareness during peacetime, and we need to raise awareness every time we can. We were developing specific military training, for example, for engineers, to explain them what is cultural property. Sometimes the troops really don't have any idea what is cultural property, where can we find them, and sometimes for engineers it's really helpful to have a basic presentation of what is archaeology. And we were developing that, and we will conduct a new training about that. But every time doing pre-deployment, we try to put an input about cultures and cultural heritage, as we want to maybe more focus on a legal perspective during training, for example, in our military academy, when they train basics officer about the legal perspective of war. We started to deploy some military curators on the field, first to explain our chain of command, what are the issues about cultural property and how can they use them. For us on a military perspective, it's not our duty to preserve and to protect the entire cultural heritage of the world. We are, as military officer, first we are engaged in a military operation and in a military hierarchy, and therefore first we put our commanders some tools to preserve and to develop this CPP awareness to avoid damage and to protect our commanders on that topic. But then we are explaining them how can they use cultural property protections, for example, to gain influence, to cooperate with the host nations, with civilian authorities, with locals. There is really a lot to do in that topic. So we already deployed 2 curators, one in Mali and in 2019, and one in Central African Republic in 2018, and we want to develop those deployments in the next years, as we want to develop international collaborations. I think of the Cultural Property Protection Unit, as the new Monuments Man in the US, as we develop really helpful dialogues with the Italian army, Austrian army, with Lebanon too. There is really many things to do to help us to be better together for tomorrow. To finish, I want to focus, because we are speaking about the blue shield, but even the French army adopted this emblem a couple of years ago in 2013. We put a blue shield on the first French military curator badges. So therefore, for the first time, the French army adopts this emblem as an official army emblem. This is there is really three different badges who want the blue shield. This one is a gold emblem for military curators, but we even have the silver emblem for museum staff, and the copper emblem for heritage officer in corps. In every corps, in every regiment, they can wear this emblem, and we can put the blue shield in every unit in France. We developed this emblem on training fields to raise awareness and to train the troops, because they could face this emblem during wartime. So they need to see it first, and sometimes just to discover it and just to ask what is this thing. It's a blue shield, so that means it's a cultural property and it have to be preserved. And we, as a cultural property protection unit, we are currently working to officially adopt the blue shield as an official army patch to be displayed on every uniform of people who are in charge of cultural property protection during peacetime, but even during wartime. Thank you. If you have any questions, so feel free to write it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a really fascinating perspective. We have had a question come in, and it's one for both yourself and for Commander Curtis, if I may. So how do the cultural protection units in armed forces specifically cooperate with civilian entities like the Blue Shield and other civilian stakeholders? So could you give us a little bit more detail on that? And then I'll pass that question over to Commander Curtis. Thank you.
Actually, the question about cooperations, during peacetime, it's quite easy. We need to find the key actors on a local ground, on an official ground, it's quite easy. During wartime, it's much more difficult to find the right actors. There is many possibilities, but the first one is if I'm thinking about Africa, forget the emails, because nobody not every people have access to computers or internet, but use other tools. This needs time to find the key actors, but this is possible because and specifically on the cultural heritage professional, everybody now who is in charge of this collection, this museum, this site. So after 1 month, it's possible to have a cartography of every key actors in an area. One of the things maybe from a French perspective, me as an army officer, sometimes it's maybe more difficult to speak with NGOs because there is always a reluctance of an official institution to speak with NGOs. So there is always a possibility to share and to develop a common understanding.
Thank you very much. And Roger, would you like to answer that question as well?
Yeah, so in a UK context, the dialogue with the NGOs should actually be ongoing in peacetime or before tension and conflict, as Captain Tim mentioned. And those dialogues they sort of happen in the background all the time, with exchanges, occasional contributions to events like this, and vice versa. As one heads towards a potential situation, invariably the focus is, where is the CP? And a big part of the CP officer's job that I hadn't quite covered in my brief really is that you're the marshaller of the data on what is where, because if you don't know where it is, you can't stop your people from damaging it or inadvertently putting it in harm's way. So quite a lot of the dialogue is about place, location, and obviously the Blue Shield has expertise in that, and indeed several other NGOs also have areas. So you piece together this collection of data to form the best picture you can, and that's perhaps one of the main ones. It also comes into the area of first response. The UK CPPU is not a first aid organisation for cultural heritage. We're there to support the military and guide them through their legal obligations under the Hague Convention. But amongst that goes in a lot of other enabling, often under what is sometimes called CIMIC, civil military cooperation under NATO doctrine. And there are many stakeholders that the military will be engaging in with respect to services, critical infrastructure, and other areas, of which the cultural landscape, the heritage landscape, is but one. And the idea is, under Hague, that you have these links and connections already made, so that when you're in the area of question, you're not stumbling around in the dark trying to find out who's where and who's doing what.
Thank you so much. So as always, any more questions, please do put them into the chat. Our next speaker is Michael Dela Cruz, and just bear with me, I'm just going to share his PowerPoint. We've had some sound issues, so if this doesn't come through, can you let me know? I'm just about to start it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Dela Cruz, and I am with Blue Shield International. In my own contribution to this day's discussion, I'd like to offer my reflections on how my own perspectives on cultural property or cultural heritage protection have been shaped over time and in the context of my professional experiences, both with the military and most recently with the Blue Shield. I will first offer some broad reflections on three key professional experiences that brought CPP to the foreground and how they shifted my perspective in light of each one of them. Then I shall describe two developmental activities I have been involved with the U.S. Army in addressing CPP in military operations. I'll follow this up with how I believe the Blue Shield approach currently relates to these types of efforts, before providing some concluding thoughts on how the Blue Shield approach can support a more expansive engagement by the military in cultural property protection. It was during NATO stabilization operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early part of my career that I first observed the deliberate destruction of cultural property to meet political ends. What we see here is the state of the National Library of Bosnia following its deliberate bombardment by Bosnian Serb forces. Although I was not aware at the time that this would largely inspire the second protocol of the Hague Convention, I became acutely aware of the concept of cultural erasure as an instrument of effectively genocidal intention, and instilled within me a recognition of an international responsibility for the protection of cultural heritage. During my rather extended periods of service in both Iraq and Afghanistan, cultural property once again became an issue of concern. There has been a great deal of warranted criticism regarding the failure of coalition forces in considering the potential impact of military operations on both Iraqi and Afghan cultural heritage. Although it was clear that this failure had a negative impact on operations and public opinion, I likewise recognized that there had been successful efforts, such as the Joint Antiquities Task Force, that worked to remediate this issue. The essential takeaway for me at the time was that the military had a responsibility to develop such capabilities to address CPP in the area of operations. Following the rapid rise of the Islamic State during a period where I was completing my doctoral studies in fine art and classical reception, the destruction of monuments in Palmyra by ISIS had a profound effect on my own sense of cultural heritage protection as an intensely personal issue. I would find myself some years later supporting counter-ISIS operations in 2018 and 2019, and I had then the opportunity to directly engage with efforts to mitigate or at least assess the impact on multiple sites in the Middle Euphrates Valley, such as at Dura Europos. In the wake of these experiences, I resolved to become more engaged with CPP on a professional level. While assigned to the Plans section at 1st Special Forces Command, I advocated for an organizational concept co-developed with Major Tommy Levoti, an archaeologist and former Marine Reconnaissance Platoon commander, called the Cultural Heritage Advisory and Assessment Detachment. The idea behind the CHAD, as we called it, was to develop a rapidly deployable, operationally and tactically oriented team to support military cultural heritage missions. It would be comprised of 11 personnel organized into leadership, operations, and cultural heritage assessment and exploitation sections. The team could potentially be augmented by individuals from the interagency or other partner organizations like the FBI, Interpol, or UNESCO. Military cultural heritage expertise would be drawn from the then newly established Military Government Specialist Program, with specific expertise in the area of cultural heritage. In developing the specific roles and responsibilities of the CHAD, there was a clear emphasis on the operational relevance of cultural heritage in the context of military operations, to include support to combatant commanders and battle staffs in integrating cultural heritage into staff processes and decision-making, the conduct of reconnaissance, survey, and assessment of cultural property or heritage sites in support of military operations, a forensic approach to evaluating cultural heritage sites for potential intelligence information about enemy adversaries or criminal elements, and identifying hazards, risks, and liabilities that cultural heritage might present in the battle space that could impact operations. Although the Hague Convention of 1954 is not explicitly mentioned in this list of roles and responsibilities, it was nonetheless envisioned as an underwriting element of the unit's mission in the following ways: ensuring a duty of care for cultural resources in the context of military activities, both for U.S. and partner military forces, identification of requirements and resources to protect cultural property, supporting partner forces in cultural property resource management strategies, and developing awareness and understanding of CPP through joint training activities. While these activities directly relate to addressing obligations under the Hague Convention, it is important to note that in advocating for the detachment, we emphasized how addressing cultural heritage issues would enhance military effectiveness, rather than emphasizing it as a burden or obligation to commanders. Unfortunately, with the inability of U.S. Army Special Operations Command to secure funding for the Institute for the Support for Military Governance, where the detachment would reside, this concept was never realized. So it is now within the operational forces at the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, where I am now currently assigned in my capacity as a reserve officer, that current efforts to develop CPP capability presently reside. Reinvigorating a capacity in military government, which took initial shape during the Allied campaigns in World War II, the command is once again recruiting first-tier talent from both the uniform ranks and the civilian sector across 5 general functional areas. These include civil security, justice and reconciliation, humanitarian assistance and social welfare, governance and participation, and economic stability and infrastructure. These personnel are assigned across 5 strategically and regionally oriented civil affairs commands that service geographic commanders with areas of operation that span the globe. Within this developing cadre of subject matter experts are a growing group of heritage and preservation officers, informally known as the Army Monuments Officers. In organizing these Army Monuments Officers within such an expansive institutional framework, the range of activities encompasses more strategic and organizational developmental objectives. As a result, the command has structured the activities of the Army Monuments Officers across 5 work streams or lines of effort. These include policy development and joint interagency integration, training of military and non-military personnel, geospatial integration and knowledge management, support to joint intelligence preparation of the environment, and direct support to military operations. These represent not just work streams, but also areas of functional capability that are currently being generated. The numerical order of the lines of effort is not meant to indicate their relative level of importance or priority, but rather suggest how they are nested in the wider process of CPP capability building throughout the Department of Defense. Policy sets the stage for the development of doctrine and training. The contribution of robust geospatial and civil information management tools allows these trained cadres to support understanding of the operational environment and ultimately become relevant, that is, relevant operationally, to combatant commanders. With these experiences in mind, the Blue Shield widens the scope in which military cultural protection efforts become part of a greater enterprise and community of concern and interest. Blue Shield national committees, as they are increasingly being formed around the world, are in a unique position to support and broker coordination between their respective militaries, law enforcement, and other uniformed agencies, and a broad range of stakeholders to include other government entities such as ministries of foreign affairs or foreign development, interior, or emergency management, legislative representatives or entities dealing with cultural property law or legal issues, the heritage management and preservation organizations, humanitarian relief and other non-governmental organizations responding to crises or natural or man-made disasters, local communities and their representatives concerned about their local heritage and the impact of military operations, and media and news outlets reporting on cultural property related impacts. All of these could be through routine updates on cultural property developments, situation-dependent collaboration meetings, standing interagency coordination groups, and press releases or programmed social media, among other means and methods. In fostering CPP through a developmental model as demonstrated currently in the U.S. Department of Defense and likewise replicated to a similar extent in the UK MOD, the Blue Shield Network can assist similarly minded defense institutions. Military organizations are always in a sequential process of planning, preparation, and execution in what is also known as the operations process. Blue Shield Network activities can constructively impact at any point in this process. In more broad terms, these developmental activities help support the Blue Shield's four-tier approach to protecting cultural property during military operations through sustained awareness, pre-deployment preparation, prosecution of military operations, including conflict, and in post-operational transition and stabilization. Blue Shield expertise can have direct constructive impact on the conduct of military operations with respect to cultural property protection. This is achieved through encouraging the incorporation of cultural factors into the military decision-making process during all phases of an operation. This applies not only to combat operations, but also security cooperation and disaster response missions. As a case in point, Blue Shield recently supported U.S. Southern Command security cooperation efforts by coordinating a subject matter exchange on cultural heritage site assessment with U.S. Army Civil Affairs personnel, members of the Honduran Army and Special Forces, and the Honduran Institute for History and Anthropology. The objectives of this engagement were to develop expertise in both U.S. and Honduran militaries to support the Honduran government in assessing often remote and inaccessible cultural heritage sites potentially damaged by extreme weather events, such as hurricanes. All this is meant to convey that while the Hague Convention of 1954 is largely focused on a situation of armed conflict, by opening up mechanisms of exchange between heritage, humanitarian, and uniform sectors, the span of engagement for constructive impact of CPP on military operations includes the entire conflict continuum and the entire range of military operations, from peace to war, from security cooperation to large-scale combat operations. CPP in a military context can take on a constructive, consolidating, and caretaking role. In addressing the question, what is CPP, I have taken a first-person approach to hopefully demonstrate that as a concept, it is a somewhat dynamic one that varies according to organizational perspective and scope of concern. In my case, it was initially brought up in the context of the instrumentalization of cultural property, resulting in its erasure. Then, as a requisite military capability to minimize liability to mission and support combatant commanders, followed by an intensely personal, moral imperative to preserve the heritage of classical antiquity and the West. Recently, I have viewed it as a template for organizational development to shape behaviors across the breadth of the organization. And now, in a Blue Shield context, as a unifying framework for cross-sector integration to address a broad spectrum of military circumstances. Ultimately, as a concept, I would hold that it is one that is flexible, dynamic, and enabling, one that evolves similarly, as do we. Thank you for your attention.